all layouts need some sort of staging, whether you're running just prototype operations or just doing train running. This video will cover some of the major considerations when you're thinking about adding staging to a track plan in progress or an existing model railroad. Now, the reason why you might think about adding staging is staging kind of represents points beyond your layout, beyond the bench work. It's a different part of the world or the region, as per example. And so these represents trains that start from somewhere else and end up on your layout, or they might start on your layout and go off somewhere else, or maybe just drive right on through. They don't even stop. It's like a passenger train passing your station, or a unit coal train passing your area. But it has no interaction of running. And maybe because you personally like to watch those things or have it, it's kind of neat for you to see it. And also another point is that staging allows you to store trains on your layout and then not having to handle them all the time. Frankly, especially today's modern equipment is very detailed. There's a lot of detailed parts. Put a finger in the wrong place, you can break something off. And then it's also just hard to, you're always constantly messing with boxes and things, constantly moving things on and off. And maybe you can do that for a little bit of a time, but frankly, doing a lot of it, if you wanted to, you didn't have a staging yard on your railroad, you're just running trains around a loop or something. And so you got this, a 20-car coal train, you constantly have to take off, and you're going to put these, auto racks on, and take that off and try to manhandle, multiple, double 5-unit, double stack, cars. After a while, they will potentially get kind of old. So the idea here, you can have a little bit more, efficient operation and less handling of your trains. And keeping in mind, staging doesn't have to be huge yards somewhere. They can just be a single track, or a single track, a couple tracks. They don't need to be very big. The biggest question people have with staging is, well, how much do I need? Now, there is some rules of thumbs out there I've seen in the press, like this 2n+1 rule of thumb, where they say you should take the number of staging tracks you think you need by your plan or something, your idea, but double it and then add 1. So if I figured if I needed like six staging tracks, I really should have 13 instead what I really should build. But frankly, sometimes these rules of thumbs can do us disservice. You think, well, I don't have room to add all the staging I need, so I really can't add it. But it's really more important is to have it's better to have a little bit of staging than none at all. You can always do something. And again, it doesn't even have to be a big yard. It can be a single track or two. Frankly, in my current layout at home here, I only have room for a little bit. It's less than I want, but that's all I can fit. Ideally, the staging is been part of your track plan from the beginning, and you kind of built it in. However, a lot of times staging is really kind of trial and error. Even if you got a prototype plan, and when you're trying to run it, and you may have to do some tweaking, you realize your staging you assumed may be inadequate in one part of your layout and too much in another part of the layout. Or if you're just doing a rail fan layout, and you're just running, and maybe you thought, well, maybe I could have a hidden siding somewhere that works, but in reality, maybe you end up wanting to run in more varieties of trains than you thought you did. And then you find that your one track is inadequate, and you figure, how can I add some more somewhere? And, as for example, for myself, I had a past layout where I had some, I wanted to add some staging, I didn't put it in the plan originally. So I ended up ripping apart, mountain to get access to some, trackage that was there. I built hidden storage tracks underneath this mountain and rebuilt the scenery back up, back on top of it again. Some folks will add a whole lower deck to their layout. That works. Since you don't have a problem with grades, going back up to the main part of the layout. Or some folks may find there's room on a shelf in their room. They could run a little staging yard. Some will punch a hole through the wall and put it into a shelf on the opposite side of a wall, opposite of their layout. Sometimes that works. But again, it's all you want to be able to accommodate some sort of staging. I've seen some things the press would it could be problematic. We have some of the serial type staging in a helix where you put multiple sets of curved crossovers in all the way up, and then you can store trains in an alternate configuration all the way up a helix. And that could add some different other complications, but there's some innovative ways of accommodating staging on your layout. So almost every railroad can have some sort of staging. Now, of course, a caveat to having staging yards, especially if you're adding more than one, it's important that they be balanced, because if you don't have them balanced properly, you could literally have multiple trains leaving one staging yard, and there's no room in the other staging yard, for instance. So the idea is you make sure that they're generally balanced. You don't necessarily have to have one in one. You could have, for instance, two staging yards on one side. Maybe they're representing two different railroads on one end, and then the one on the other end of the layout's a big yard. So you can have something that's 100 car capacity on one, and then you got a 50 and a 50, or a 70 and a 30 or something. That works as long as it's generally balanced. It doesn't have to be exact, but you want it generally pretty much close to the same, because you need to have empty tracks and full tracks. And so ideally, because if your tracks are all full on both yards, you're going to need to basically dispatch them simultaneously from both ends and have them pass in the middle somewhere. In order, you're always doing the exchange, but sometimes you don't necessarily want to do that. You want to run one and then run another one in the opposite direction. Maybe you're just solo operator and it's difficult to run two trains at once without getting confused, for instance, or getting a derailment or your throttles mixed up. There are different types of staging yards. And said, these can be now. So here we have the picture here. These staging yards can represent. They don't have to be big. They can just represent here just like a single branch line, or could be going behind a backdrop, representing a single industry. Maybe this is an industry that you don't have room to model on your railroad, and this is maybe it's an automobile import yard, and this you literally have a hidden track in here, room to put a half dozen auto racks on, for instance. You don't have room in your layout to model the yard, so this can be a staging for an industry. Or maybe it's a small yard representing branch line or another railroad, or again, you're a stub yard that's representing a major type of facility. Or you could have a staging yard also just like a loop. This could be on top of a helix, on a lower deck, bottom deck, under a peninsula, in another room somewhere. But you can do it in a loop configuration as well. You don't necessarily have to have the yards all hidden. For instance, you can have it hidden. For instance, whether it's behind again another room, another backdrop, another deck, it can be hidden. An example here on the screen here is an example that I did on a previous layout. You can see that I had a hidden track. This is kind of showing the yard here, and see in the back there's a GP9 and a passenger train in the back. That was a 2-track hidden staging yard just for passenger trains, as an example. And this is shown before I had a removable backdrop in front. So this is showing that picture. Also, you can also do it as a visible staging yard. This works that you can have areas that kind of look like a yard, but it's not. For instance, like a passenger train, a passenger terminal, I should say. That's a perfect place because it's perfect. You can have passenger trains sitting there. They look perfectly fine sitting there. Whether this is terminals at the end of your layout or it's in the middle of the layout, it looks great. Another possibility is have a division crew change point. A lot of times here you can have a yard of multiple tracks and whole trains just sitting there. and waiting for new crews. And look, and it's perfectly prototypical. And these yards could be literally be out in some community, some rural community somewhere, and it looks perfectly fine. It does not look out of place. Here's an example of another picture I had on this previous layout where I had a yard here. This represented some of the Northern Pacific Terminal and Union Station yards in Portland, Oregon, where you see the back is where I had a freight yard, kind of that visible staging. In the front, you can see where I had passenger platforms. That's that's the opposite end of that hidden storage yard, passenger yard, showing the other end of the layout, place where I could store a couple passenger trains at the passenger terminal. Sometimes those would be for trains that ran on the layout, and sometimes not, of different railroads, as per example. The last type of yard is really kind of the fiddle yard, and this is a little bit different. Instead of storing whole trains, these are places where you can actually take cars off and put them into boxes, put them onto shelves, especially in special containers, a drawer or something. So like, here, and another picture from the past layout. Here's a 3-track storage yard that went in front of my water heater. That I had it in place where I could remove it in case I needed the furnace and water heater maintenance. But again, this could be used as the staging to hold whole trains, but also was meant to be able to pull cars off of and put them on a shelf, because that represented points south of my modeled area. Here's an example on the current layout where we have a interchange track here, and we're now punching it through here. It's all kind of drafty right now, but the track right here on the inside punching through here is a single track place where I can actually store a full train and make this interchange. So if it was just a dummy stub end, we can actually make it just a single train and put like a half dozen cars behind a switcher here. And also through the backdrop, we have a double-ended storage track here, and this kind of represents destinations to the south, and it's kind of generally meant for passenger trains. Of course, again, it's not as ideally long as I would wish, but again, it's what I can fit. Here's an example of a fiddle staging yard track here. That while this looks like a siding, is actually meant to be a place where I would represents points to the north. We already had on the side of this backdrop here, we had points to the south. This track here kind of represents points to the north. So we would have a passenger train come out of the yard that would over here on this side of the backdrop, run around the layout, and end up here eventually. Then we'd basically have fiddle it in, and fiddle it off again. Again, not completely ideal, but here we would go onto the shelf. And this is where you had to go out to cats. And he wants to watch trains. This cat, he likes watching trains go around, so he's waiting patiently for that to happen on this layout. But this here is an example here of a kind of a fiddle yard and visible staging. So having a train sitting here may looks like just waiting for another train to pass on the main. But it represents a visible type of staging track.